Hello and welcome to the fifth and final session of our Lent course on how to eat bread, 21 nourishing ways to read the Bible. Although of course we're just doing 5 of them in these 5 weeks. And the one we're looking at today is the way the Bible uses stories to grab our attention and to get a reaction from us. And it seems to me that the way the Bible does that in the Old Testament really models how it's okay for us to feel our emotions in the way that we read a story, and actually we should pay attention to our emotions when we read a story and not be scared or worried if we react to a story quite negatively, if it triggers some strong emotion in us, but instead to spend time exploring why it has caused that, and to accept that it might be that the purpose of that story for us today was to cause that emotion, and to mean that through that we question all sorts of things about why we're getting so angry. There are lots of bits of the Bible that make us wince when we read them. You'll often find that these bits are bracketed out in our lectionaries or in reading plans as kind of optional bits that we might use. So for example, often lines from the psalm like "Blessed are those who take your children and dash their brains out against a rock" are often omitted. And some of those bits in the Bible that really make us wince, really blatant examples of racial and religious hatred, are often used against Christians as one of the reasons not to take the Bible seriously. But if we are Christians who do read the Bible and take it seriously and believe that we are meant to take it seriously, how are we meant to respond to passages like that? Well, let me read you a story that I think is absolutely fascinating, and that in a way was the inspiration behind this whole book. And that's 2 Samuel chapter 12. This comes just after King David has raped / seduced Bathsheba and had her husband killed to cover up the fact that he's got her pregnant. And there's a prophet called Nathan, and Nathan comes to confront David about this really unsavory episode. So 2 Samuel 12, verses 1 to 10. The Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, "There were 2 men in a certain city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb which he had brought. He brought it up and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his own food and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveller to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, 'As God lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb 4-fold because he did this thing and because he had no pity.' Nathan said to David, 'You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife.'" Now, I mean, you could do an entire series of sermons on the story of David and Bathsheba. And there are all sorts of problematic things about that passage, the way in which women are treated simply as possessions, the way in which Bathsheba doesn't even get named in here. She's simply described as another man's possession who shouldn't have been taken. It's a really unsavory story of male entitlement. on the part of someone who is meant to be God's hero, God's anointed king. You know, God says, I would have given you as much as you wanted. He's a hero of the tradition. And yet this episode really shows him to have feet of clay. But what I want to focus on in this particular section is on Nathan's method of challenging David. He doesn't come along and simply condemn him. He doesn't come along and explain why what he's done is wrong. He doesn't explain the ethical problems of what he's done. He tells a story. And he tells what's clearly a fictional story. There were never two people with their sheep, as if he's recounting an actual incident to the king. And David clearly understands the story to be a factual account of an injustice that's gone on. And what kings did in those times was that they sat in their courts, and people came, if they had stories of injustice, they came and told them, and the king gave judgment. So when Nathan tells him this story, David reacts as any right-thinking person would. He goes, well, that's outrageously unfair. And because he's the king and has the power to make a difference, he says, right, this is what is going to happen. He deserves to die. I'm not going to kill him. But what I am going to say is he has to pay back 4 times. And then, of course, Nathan says, you're the man. This is what you did. And it seems to me that this episode, in which the prophet Nathan tells David this story and then springs a trap on him, is a key passage when it comes to dealing with the parts of the Bible that anger us or appall us. Here, what happens is that the prophet Nathan gives us a model of handling and using story that suggests that what matters most about how we respond is precisely that we are appalled. So notice, it doesn't matter. This story is not literally true. There's absolutely no suggestion that actual sheep were harmed in the making of this story. Nathan's purpose is not to get justice for a fictional sheep farmer. Nathan's purpose in telling the story is to provoke an emotional reaction in his hearer, to make David angry at the injustice, to get him in touch with his sense of justice and injustice, and to make him determined to do something about it. And it's only then that he points out that this is David's own behavior. Now, at one level, within the level of this narrative itself, that's simply a really clever technique. It's a clever way of trapping David into condemning himself. But it's also, it seems to me, an example of what God might be doing for us through the inclusion of some really very problematic and disturbing stories and incidents in the canon of Scripture. One of the things that has been really quite dangerous and problematic in the history of Christianity is a tendency to read these nasty incidents, stories of rape, stories of genocide, as if they were both literally descriptive of God's will for humanity and prescriptive for how Christians should behave. So, for example, passages that tell of genocide as a punishment for unrighteousness have often been read on these two levels. They've been read as if they describe incidents that really happen, that God wanted to punish people for unrighteousness, and prescribe that it's God's will that unrighteousness should be destroyed. And then the logical next step that people have taken is to say, well, therefore, it's our job to go and enact God's justice and take destructive action on God's behalf. And we all know many, many examples of where that's led. And let's be honest, some of the texts were almost certainly written with exactly that in mind, to justify, in religious terms, actions that either had been taken or that the writers wanted to be taken. The biblical texts record the whole range of human emotions and desires, including a huge variety of ways in which greed, fear, envy, or even the simple and very natural desire for security for ourselves and for our families can lead us to violence, cruelty, and destruction. And in very many cases, it seems that the authors felt they were describing very justified God-given actions. Whereas now when we read their accounts, we absolutely recoil very often from thinking of these stories as being that. And if that's something you want to explore further, there's a whole section on that in, in part 3, particularly in chapters 16, 17 and 18, which look at some of the insights of liberation theology. Maybe we'll do another course on that another time. But what I want to suggest in this session is that Nathan's use of story here suggests an alternative way of reading those episodes in the Bible that we find when we read them repulsive or appalling. Focusing not for the moment on the historical or the ethical questions that they raise, but focusing on the emotions that they evoke in us. It's quite an Ignatian approach, really, and there's a whole other section in part 2 of the book on Ignatian approaches and other experiential approaches. What if the bits of the Bible that appall us are functioning for us as Nathan's story did for David? If Nathan had simply described and condemned David's behaviour, then his message would have been much less powerful. David may well have reacted defensively. He might have attempted to justify himself. He might even then have persuaded himself that his own justification was correct and become even more entrenched in his belief that he had a right to act as he did. We know that's how human minds very often work. Whereas by telling a story, Nathan first evoked in David something of God's passion for justice and righteousness, so that he was then able to recognize how his own behavior violated those ideals. And that suggests to me that when a passage enrages us, this story suggests that a more fruitful question than, is it historically true? Or, does God really want us to behave like that? A more fruitful question than those might be for us to ask, wow, that really angers me. That makes me want to throw the Bible across the room. That makes me want to shout and scream at God. Why am I so angry? What is it about the behavior that's been described, whether it's of people or of God, that's so appalling to you? And then consider, what if the purpose of that story being in the Bible, because, all sorts of stories could have been chosen to go in the Bible, and somehow through some strange process of canonical collection, which, we believe is in some way inspired by and guided by God's wisdom, that has been handed down to us. This strange collection of stories and poetry and so on has been handed down today. And somehow today you are sitting there reading this story, which has really made you angry or really made you upset, really triggered you in some way. What if, just as a thought experiment, the reason that story is in there and has come to you today is like Nathan telling this story to David? What if the teller of this story suddenly turned around and told you that the reason they told you this story was to bring you to a fresh realization of just how appalling such behavior is? What if that's outrageous? I hate that, is exactly what God wants to say to us through that story being included in the Bible. And what happens then if we take the next step and turn to ourselves and hear you are the one said to you in response to your righteous anger about the behavior being described? What happens if you use that revulsion that a particular passage might evoke in you as a spur to self-examination? Not taking the story literally, there's no suggestion that, that David had literally stolen a sheep, but saying, actually, what has really angered me here? That sense in that story of injustice. That's not fair. That's just horrible that somebody would abuse their position of power like that and take something away from someone else, that makes me really angry, because that's not how the world should be. If I feel that angry about that, what is there in my life that actually that's tapping into? Do I feel hard done by in some way? Am I uneasily aware that I'm part of patterns of unfairness? If the passage that angers you, the story that stirs really deep feelings of revulsion in you, were being told as a parable to you, what point would be being made? Because that's what a parable is. It's a fictional story with a point. What point has your anger pointed out to you? And it might be that that's something in the wider world, in the society, in the way that that we live, that's being pointed out to you. But it might also be that there's something much more personal, much more hidden. It's not always the case, but very often the things that we react most violently against are the things that reveal our own shadow side, or our own passion, or our own vocation. Our own shadows, because we're often most upset or revolted by behavior or traits that we subconsciously really dislike in ourselves. So we might be particularly exercised by stories of violence or murder, for example, not because we literally are murderers, but perhaps there's a rigorously suppressed shadow side of our personality, and we're actually quite worried or nervous or ashamed of our own violent dislikes. Or perhaps there might be a strong reaction to an upsetting story, which reveals something much more positive, which reveals something that actually you have a really deep call to do something about. Maybe there's something about where your true passions and vocation lie. We can't all fight against every injustice in the world. We can't all try and make everything better. Maybe there's something about which particular stories most upset you that says something about where you feel a call for your energies to be directed. Is there one particular deep injustice in society that particularly upsets you? So I just invite you to try that. Kind of keep it in your back pocket as a technique, so that if there's something that particularly upsets you, or a passage, you know, that's read in church that you somehow find you feel yourself reacting very violently against, well, if God's like that, I don't want anything to do with him, that kind of thing. Just notice that you're thinking that. And, you know, when you have time and space, just try looking again at that passage in this way. And if you want to, in your group now, kind of try this approach, I've suggested a couple of stories, Genesis 22, or Judges chapter 16, which you might try. I mean, they might not be stories that upset you, I don't know, but they're ones that I find quite problematic. Try reading those through this lens of the prophet Nathan's use of story, because it seems to me that this is placed here, you know, fairly early in the Bible, there in those core five books, and it's designed, I think, to show us something about where is it? 2 Samuel. Yeah, sorry, it's not in the first 5 books at all. But it's in those really early core stories. It's designed, I think, not just to tell us stuff about David, or of course it is, you know, that is its surface meaning, and there's something very profound there about justice and righteousness and how good people can do bad things. You know, so many of these stories, they're rich stories. The reason they've been passed on is because they have so many different layers to them. And actually, if you're interested in the layers idea, there's a whole section about that as well in section 2 of the book. And it seems to me that one of the layers of meaning of that story from 2 Samuel is to give us a model in the core biblical texts themselves of how we can use the very strong emotions that some of the stories that the Bible tells us evoke in us. Another one, if you want to try this with a New Testament passage that might be quite interesting, is the parable of the unjust steward, or the parable of the workers in the vineyard. The parable of the workers in the vineyard really upsets people. It comes up in the lectionary every so often. Whenever I preach on it, I get people saying that's just not fair. If I've worked harder, I should get more. And this is a really interesting way to approach any passage that just strikes you as not fair. It brings up those very, it's quite a childlike, deep passion for justice and for righteousness. So yeah, when something makes you angry, when something strikes you as unfair, when something upsets you, think about that emotion having put you in touch with something that's very deep in you, something that's very deep in your sense of what's right, of who God is, of what good is, and analyze what it is about the way the world is that story is challenging, and whether there's something in you yourself that story is inviting you to examine at a much more deep level. So as I say, try that perhaps with the parable of the unjust steward, or with the parable of the workers in the vineyard, or with Genesis chapter 2, or with Judges 16. Or it might be that if you're doing this in a group, someone says, oh, the passage I've always had problems with is whatever, is X. Great, look that up, read it, and have a think about this technique. But also, this isn't one to just try all the time. This is one, as I say, to keep in your back pocket, and when you feel yourself having a very strong reaction against the story, just remember me telling you this, and go back to it and think about it in the light of Nathan telling that story to David. So there we are, 5 quick whistle-stop approaches to reading the Bible that are modelled in the Bible itself. And that's the core of the first section of this book, which is ways of reading the Bible that the Bible itself suggests and models to us. The second section of the book is on historical ways of reading the Bible, particularly focusing on techniques and approaches from Augustine through to Ignatius, kind of through the kind of early church and medieval periods. To show really that, the idea of reading the Bible in different ways isn't a kind of crazy modern liberal approach. It's not a wishy-washy approach that's trying to explain away the Bible. This has been at the heart of most core Christian spirituality of the Bible for almost all of Christian history. And then the final section of the book, which I've subtitled rather cheekily Molecular Gastronomy, is about some of the more contemporary ways of reading the Bible. So things, as I've mentioned tonight, like liberation theology, feminist theology, dramatic theory, experimental play, ecological interpretations, and so on. And those are not necessarily ways that you'll try yourself. Some of them might be, some of them I would definitely encourage you to have a go at. But they're partly just because they're things that you'll often hear about when you're reading commentaries, and it's helpful to know what they are, what's being talked about. So I hope you've enjoyed the course. I hope you go on to really have some great discussion about how you handle passages that really anger you. And I really hope you enjoy the rest of the book. Bye.